Negotiation is a courtesy. It is the polite fiction that keeps the universe from tearing itself apart. For 6,000 years, the Galaxy Council relied on that fiction. They threatened, they blustered, and eventually the lesser species folded. Then came humanity. When the Council demanded the surrender of the outer colonies, they expected the usual diplomatic groveling. What they got was a dead communication line and an armed fleet. Panic is a strange thing to witness on a galactic scale. Victor Sullivan sat at the apex of the grand deliberation amphitheater. The translation collar around his thick neck hummed, a constant irritating vibration against his scales. To humanity, he was Minister Sullivan, a name assigned by the Council's absurdly thorough cultural integration algorithm, which mapped alien vocalizations to the nearest digestible Western equivalent. To the Council, he was the architect of compliance. He stared at the empty space above the central hololith projector. A second ago, the projection had displayed the face of the human representative, Akiva Shaw. Shaw had looked tired. He had looked beaten. Victor had delivered the ultimatum with the practiced ease of a predator playing with dead prey. Surrender the mining rights of the Orion Spur. Accept Council overseers. Disband your heavy naval assets. Do this, and we will welcome you into the galactic fold. It was the same speech Victor had given to a dozen other species. The response was always a variation of the same theme: outrage, followed by bargaining, followed by submission. Shaw hadn't done any of that. He had listened. He had rubbed his jaw, sighed, and reached out of frame. Then the feed snapped to black. Victor blinked his secondary eyelids. He drummed his thick, multi-jointed fingers on the polished surface of his podium. The amphitheater, packed with delegates from 80 different subjugated worlds, all bearing equally sanitized names like Harrison, Miller, and Davis, fell into a dense, confused silence. The ambient hum of the climate control suddenly sounded loud enough to deafen. "Re-establish the link," Victor ordered. His voice, run through the translation matrix, boomed in perfect unaccented English across the chamber. Down in the pit, Chief Technician Gregory, a spindly avian creature draped in bureaucratic robes, frantically tapped at a glowing terminal. Feathers ruffled in genuine distress. "Minister Sullivan, I cannot." "Did they experience a power failure?" Victor asked. He leaned forward. The leather of his chair creaked. "Route the signal through their planetary relays. Override their local comms if you have to. I am not finished speaking." Gregory looked up. His compound eyes clicked in the harsh light. "There is no failure, Minister. The human vessel deliberately severed the connection. They have scrubbed their local routing protocols. They are blocking our handshake pings." A murmur rippled through the delegates. It started low, a rustle of fine fabrics and shifting weight, and grew into a nervous chatter. Species that had spent centuries bowing to the Council's every whim looked at one another in profound confusion. Nobody hung up on the Council. It simply wasn't done. "They are stalling," said Delegate Peterson, a massive blocky entity from the core worlds. "A childish tactic. They think if they do not hear the deadline does not exist." Victor stood up. He smoothed the front of his tailored tunic. He didn't like this. He survived for 2 centuries in the political meat grinder of the Council by reading his opponents. Shaw hadn't looked like a man trying to buy time. He had looked like a man who had finally made a very difficult, very permanent decision. "Hail their flagship," Victor commanded, keeping his tone flat. He needed to project authority. The room was watching him. "If Shaw refuses to answer, patch me through to their tactical command. Tell them the ultimatum window has been reduced from 48 hours to 12. This petulance will cost them." Gregory's terminal flashed red. Then it flashed red again. The avian technician stepped back from the console, his head tilting sharply to the side. "Well," Victor barked. "Minister," Gregory said, his translated voice trembling slightly. "I am trying to hail the flagship, but the flagship is gone." Victor frowned. "Gone where? Did they jump back to their home world?" "No, sir. The entire human diplomatic escort, all 12 vessels, have broken orbit. They did not retreat. They have shifted to combat silent running. Our long-range sensors are picking up massive thermal spikes in the Orion Spur. The human fleets," Gregory swallowed hard. "They are mobilizing, all of them." The murmurs in the chamber died instantly. The silence that replaced it was heavy, suffocating, and reeked of sudden, unfiltered dread. "Mobilizing for what?" Peterson demanded, his voice cracking. "They have 300 ships. We have 2,000 stationed in the adjacent sector. They cannot possibly be forming a defensive line. It is mathematical suicide." Victor looked back at the empty hololith. A cold, alien knot tightened in his stomach. He remembered the look in Shaw's eyes right before the screen went black. It wasn't the look of a man preparing to defend his home. It was the look of a man who had just locked the door from the inside. Akiva Shaw poured another cup of coffee. It was sludge. It tasted like burnt copper and regret, but it was hot, and right now, heat was the only thing keeping his hands from shaking. He stood in the auxiliary command center of the UNS Defiance. The lighting was kept dim, bathing the room in a harsh, utilitarian red. There were no windows here. Windows were structural weaknesses. Humans didn't build ships to look majestic against the backdrop of a nebula. They built armored boxes wrapped around massive railguns and nuclear payloads. Scout Evans walked in. She didn't bother saluting. The time for military protocol had evaporated the moment Akiva cut the feed to the council spire. She carried a hardened data slate, her face illuminated by its pale blue glow. She looked exhausted. They all did. Humanity had been preparing for this day for 40 years, ever since the first council survey ship breached their space and demanded a tribute they couldn't pay. "The fleet is holding position at Rally Point Delta," Scout said. She set the slate down on the metal table between them. "All comms are strictly hardlined. No external broadcasts. We are a black hole on their sensors." Akiva took a sip of the terrible coffee. It burned his throat. Good. It meant he was awake. "And the council?" "Flailing," Scout replied. She tapped the screen, bringing up a tactical map of the sector. Red icons clustered around the core systems, pulsing aggressively. "We're catching stray signals. Unencrypted panic. They're trying to route emergency messages to their border patrols. Sullivan is demanding we reopen diplomatic channels." Akiva barked a short, humorless laugh. "I bet he is. He wants his script back. He wants us to beg so he can offer a compromise that guts us slowly instead of all at once." Scout crossed her arms. "We're committed, Akiva. Once Admiral Hayes gives the green light, there's no walking this back. 300 ships against the largest armada in recorded history." Akiva leaned over the table, staring at the red dots. They aren't an armada, Scout. They're a police force. A very big, very heavily armed police force used to beating up unarmed civilians. He pointed to a massive cluster of red icons near the center of the map. Look at their fleet dispersion. They keep their dreadnoughts parked over their own rebellious vassal worlds to maintain order. They rely on intimidation. They expect us to hunker down around Earth and wait for them to slowly siege us into starvation, which is exactly what they are preparing for, Scout noted. They are massing their strike groups here at the edge of the Orion Spur. They think we're building a wall. Let them. Akiva set down his mug. His back ached, a dull, throbbing pain at the base of his spine that reminded him he was 58 years old and way too old to be starting a galactic war. But there was no one else. The politicians back on Earth had finally realized treaties wouldn't stop the Council from turning humanity into an indentured workforce. They had handed the keys to the military and told them to make a miracle. "Are you okay?" Scout asked quietly. Akiva looked at her. Her eyes were sharp, evaluating him not as a friend, but as a crucial component in a machine that could not afford to break. "I just condemned billions of people to a war of attrition," Akiva said, his voice dropping. "I looked a bureaucratic monster in the eye, and instead of trying to save a few million lives through compromise, I hung up the phone. No, Scout, I'm not okay. I don't think I'll ever be okay again." Scout didn't offer a platitude. She didn't tell him he did the right thing. They both knew the morality of this situation was buried under a mile of pragmatism. "If you had negotiated," she said evenly, "they would have placed an overseer in every human city. They would have drafted our children to fight in their border skirmishes against the Outer Rim insurgents. They would have bled us dry over a century, a slow death wrapped in a treaty." "I know." Akiva closed his eyes for a brief second. When he opened them, the exhaustion was still there, but the hesitation was gone. "We don't do slow deaths." He tapped the communication panel on the console. "Bridge, this is Shaw. Secure line to Admiral Hayes." A burst of static, then the gruff voice of the fleet commander filled the small room. "Hayes here. Speak, Shaw." "The Council is massing at the border, Admiral. They're expecting us to dig trenches." "I see it," Hayes replied. "They've left their supply hubs in the inner ring completely exposed, arrogant bastards." "They aren't arrogant, Admiral. They just lack imagination." Akiva looked at Scout. She nodded slowly. "Execute Operation Fracture. Give them something to panic about." "Acknowledged. Spooling slipspace drives. May God have mercy on our souls, Akiva, because I don't think we're going to leave them any." The channel clicked dead. Akiva picked up his coffee. The cup was vibrating. Deep in the bowels of the Defiance, the massive slipspace engines were spinning up, tearing a hole in the fabric of reality. They weren't jumping to Earth. They weren't retreating. They were jumping directly into the heart of Council territory. Alarms in the grand amphitheater did not blare. They chimed. It was a soft, melodic sound, designed centuries ago to alert the delegates without causing undue distress. It was an alarm built for civilized societies facing minor inconveniences. As the chimes echoed through the massive chamber, the delegates ignored them. They were too busy shouting. "This is an outrage!" Delegate Peterson roared, slamming a fist down on his console. "We gave them a deadline. They cannot simply vanish." "Quiet!" Victor Sullivan snapped, his translated voice cutting through the din. He gripped the edges of his podium, Sweat pooled beneath his collar. His technicians were frantic, screens flashing with contradictory data. "Minister," Gregory called out, his feathers standing completely on end. I have a report from Sector 4, the commercial hub at Varia." Victor felt the cold knot in his stomach turn into a block of ice. Varia wasn't on the human border. Varia was deep inside Council space. It was a massive orbital shipyard, entirely undefended because it was hundreds of light years away from any hostile frontier. "What about Varia?" Victor demanded. "It's gone, sir." The chamber went dead silent. The melodic chimes suddenly sounded terribly inadequate. "Define gone, technician," Victor said, his voice dangerously low. Communication ceased 3 minutes ago. Before the blackout, automated distress beacons triggered. Massive slipspace ruptures were detected. Thermal signatures match human capital ships. Dozens of them. They didn't hail the station. They didn't demand surrender. They exited slipspace firing mass drivers at a fraction of light speed. "That's impossible," a delegate from the naval block stammered. Admiral Nelson stood up, his face pale. "They have a range of 40 light years. Varia is 120 light years from their border. They couldn't jump there without staging points." They didn't use staging points, Victor realized, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. He looked around the room at the faces of species who had never known a real war. They only knew policing. They only knew overwhelming force applied to stationary targets. They bypassed their own safety protocols. They performed a blind, extended jump. "But the radiation," Nelson argued, shaking his head. "The structural stress on their hulls. It would severely damage their own fleet just to make the transit." Victor stared at the Admiral. "Do you think they care, Nelson? You told them they were going to lose their home world. You backed a predator into a corner, and you're surprised it's willing to break its own teeth to bite you." The terminal in front of Gregory chirped frantically. "Minister, Sector 7, the agricultural processing ring at Ceres Alpha. Slipspace ruptures detected. Multiple human destroyers. They are systematically dismantling the orbital elevators." "Sector 9, another technician yelled from the pit. "Transit Hub Delta is under attack. They are targeting the slipspace relays. They are blinding our logistical routes." Panic. Raw, unfiltered panic gripped the council. Delegates began shouting over one another, screaming for their personal guards, demanding that the armada at the human border be recalled to defend their home systems. The polite fiction of the council dissolved in less than 5 minutes. They weren't a unified galaxy. They were a collection of terrified bureaucrats realizing that their castles were built on sand. Victor slammed his fist into the console, overriding the room's audio. A deafening, localized siren burst from the speakers, forcing the delegates to cover their ears and fall silent. "Listen to me," Victor bellowed. "If we recall the fleet, we lose the border. They are trying to scatter us. They want us to chase them through the interior." "They are burning our infrastructure," Peterson screamed back. "My homeworld relies on the food shipments from Ceres Alpha. If those elevators fall, billions will starve." "That is their plan," Victor shot back. "They cannot beat us in a pitched battle, so they are attacking the very foundation of our empire. They want us to panic." "It's working!" someone yelled from the back. Victor looked at the central hololith, now displaying a map of council space. Red dots were blossoming like a virus across the interior sectors. The humans weren't conquering. They weren't holding territory. They were striking and moving, hitting crucial economic and logistical nodes with brutal mechanical efficiency. They weren't fighting a war of conquest. They were fighting a war of sheer spite. They had looked at the pristine, ordered machine of the Galaxy Council and decided to throw a wrench directly into the gears. Gregory looked up at Victor, his compound eyes wide with absolute terror. "Minister, I have a new reading. Sector 1. Victor stopped breathing. Sector 1 was here. The core. The council spire. "Report," Victor whispered. "Slip space anomaly forming. Distance, 200,000 kilometers. It's massive, sir. It's the human flagship. The Defiance." Victor looked up at the ceiling of the amphitheater. Beyond the layers of armor and energy shielding, the void of space waited. For 6,000 years, no enemy had ever dared jump into Sector 1. "Raise the planetary shields," Victor ordered, his voice finally losing its steady rhythm. "Order the home guard to intercept." "Shields are rising," Gregory said. Then a pause. "Sir, the human ship is broadcasting on all frequencies." Victor narrowed his eyes. "Put it through. Let's hear what Shaw wants." The audio feed crackled. The delegates held their breath. They waited for the demands. They waited for the human to list his terms for peace, to leverage the destruction they had wrought into a favorable treaty. Instead, a series of coordinates filled the screens, followed by a simple, automated voice. "Evacuate the spire. You have 10 minutes. Victor stood frozen. There was no negotiation. There was no gloating. Just a cold, calculated warning. "They wouldn't," Admiral Nelson whispered. "The planetary shields can withstand a direct orbital bombardment for days." "They aren't going to bombard us," Victor realized, staring at the telemetry data. The Defiance wasn't slowing down. It was accelerating. It was converting its entire mass into a kinetic weapon, aiming straight for the heart of the Council. The human diplomat hadn't hung up because he had nothing to say. He had hung up because the time for words was completely, irrevocably over. Panic has a distinct, acrid smell. It is the scent of ozone, sweat, and voided bowels. Victor Sullivan smelled it vividly as the grand illusion of the Galaxy Council shattered into a million screaming, clawing pieces. Victor watched from the apex of the amphitheater as the galactic elite tore each other apart. The polite facade of civilized diplomacy vanished in the span of 30 seconds. Delegate Peterson, the massive entity who had mocked the humans just minutes prior, used his sheer bulk to crush two smaller representatives from the aquatic sectors as he stampeded toward the private evacuation lifts. Admiral Nelson was shouting hoarse, useless commands into a dead comms link, completely ignored by his own security detail, who were busy fighting to secure an escape pod. "Minister!" Gregory shrieked, tugging desperately at Victor's tailored sleeve. The avian technician's feathers were plastered to his body with terror sweat. "The timer, 7 minutes to impact. We must descend to the hardened bunkers." Victor didn't move immediately. He stared at the central hololith, which tracked the incoming trajectory of the human flagship. The Defiance was accelerating at a rate that should have crushed its crew into paste. "They aren't stopping," Victor murmured, mostly to himself. The sheer, terrifying conviction of it paralyzed him. "They are actually going to do it. Minister, please!" Victor snapped out of his trance. He grabbed Gregory by the shoulder, his thick fingers digging into the technician's frail bones, and dragged him toward the emergency stairwell. The private lifts were already jammed, a bloody brawl erupting before the polished chrome doors. Victor wasn't going to die in a bureaucratic bottleneck. Millions of kilometers away, Akiva Shaw tasted copper. He lay strapped into a high-G crash couch inside the UNS Defiance's secondary command module. The lights were flashing a violent, rhythmic yellow. The ship was screaming. Every bulkhead, every rivet, every structural strut protested the insane torque of their acceleration. "Velocity is at 0.04% light speed," Scout Evans yelled over the deafening roar of the primary thrusters. She was strapped into the adjacent couch, her hands flying across a holographic interface that jittered with the ship's vibration. "Main drive core is operating at 140%. Containment will fail in 6 minutes." "We only need 5, Akiva grunted, fighting the immense pressure pressing his chest into his spine. "Initiate the breakaway sequence." Humans were outgunned, outnumbered, and out-resourced. They could not build ships as elegant as the Council's cruisers. But human engineers understood something the Council did not: redundancy. The Defiance was not a single vessel. It was a massive armored siege engine wrapped around a heavy slipspace drive, carrying a much smaller, highly stealthy command frigate hidden in its hollow spine. Blowing explosive bolts in 3, 2, 1, Scout slammed her fist down on the console. A sickening lurch rocked the small module. Deep within the belly of the dreadnought, hundreds of heavy explosive charges detonated simultaneously, severing the umbilical connections between the core hull and the command spine. The main thrusters of the Defiance flared blindingly white, propelling the massive hollowed-out shell of the flagship forward like a fired bullet. The command module, now dubbed the lifeboat, drifted backward, instantly killing its power and transitioning into a localized stealth field. Akiva watched the telemetry feed on his visor. The colossal shell of the Defiance was now a dumb, kinetic missile, accelerating unstoppably toward the Council spire. There were no life signs aboard. There was no one to negotiate with, no one to surrender, no one to redirect the ship. It was pure, unadulterated physics on a collision course with arrogance. Hard burn complete. "We are silent and adrift," Scout reported, her voice shaking slightly as the crushing G-force finally subsided. "Visual on the target," Akiva ordered quietly. A screen flickered to life. The Council homeworld, a jewel of engineered atmospheres and artificial rings, hung in the void. Surrounding it was a shimmering golden hexagonal lattice, the planetary shield. It was designed to withstand prolonged orbital bombardment from plasma batteries and laser arrays. It was not designed to catch a 2-million-ton brick of titanium and depleted uranium moving at relativistic speeds. In the bunker beneath the spire, Victor hit the floor as the shockwave hit the planet. There was no sound at first, only an unimaginable vibration that rattled the fillings in his teeth and turned his vision white. Then came the noise. It wasn't a boom. It was a prolonged, apocalyptic tearing sound, as if the fabric of the universe itself was being ripped violently in two. Above ground, the kinetic shell of the Defiance struck the apex of the golden shield. The mathematics of the impact were absolute. The shield generators, buried deep in the planet's crust, screamed as they tried to disperse the sudden, localized transfer of trillions of joules of kinetic energy. For one agonizing second, the golden lattice flared into a blinding miniature sun. Then, 12 of the primary planetary generators detonated in sequence, completely melted by the feedback loop. The shield shattered like glass. The remnants of the Defiance, now a compressed slug of superheated metal, punched through the atmosphere. It struck the upper echelons of the council spire. The impact sheared the top 300 floors off the gleaming monument, vaporizing them instantly. The shockwave flattened every structure within a 50-mile radius, kicking up a dust cloud that would choke the hemisphere for a decade. Down in the bunker, the lights flickered and died. Emergency red strobes kicked in, casting long, bloody shadows across the terrified faces of the surviving galactic leaders. Victor slowly picked himself up from the permacrete floor. He tasted blood. He looked down at his trembling hands, coated in dust that had shaken loose from the ceiling. "Are we dead?" Delegate Peterson whimpered from a corner, his blocky form curled into a pathetic sphere. Victor didn't answer. He stared at the cracked ceiling of the bunker. The humans hadn't hit the planet with a nuclear weapon. They hadn't tried to wipe out the population. They had aimed exclusively, precisely, at the spire. They had decapitated the government, humiliated the home fleet, and shattered the illusion of council invulnerability. They didn't just want a war. They wanted to send a message. 3 weeks later, the galaxy was bleeding to death. Admiral Hayes stood on the bridge of his carrier, the UNS Gettysburg, reviewing the tactical feed. The map of council space, once a neat, orderly web of secure trade routes and heavily patrolled borders, now looked like a shattered mirror. "Report from the 7th Fleet," Captain Reynolds called out from the communications pit. He looked haggard, his uniform stained with coffee and machine grease. "They hit the fuel refinement platforms over Typhon. Complete destruction. The Council dreadnoughts in Sector 4 are officially stranded. They have no fuel to jump back to the core." "Casualties?" Hayes asked, his voice rough. "We lost 2 destroyers, the Omaha and the Trenton, caught in the blast radius when the platforms cooked off." Reynolds paused. "Commander Miller reports 70% crew recovery. They're making do, Admiral." Hayes nodded slowly. "Tell Miller to patch his ships with whatever he can scavenge from the Typhon debris field and move to Rally Point Echo. Keep moving. If they stop, they die." This was the human strategy. It was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare, born from a history steeped in desperate insurgencies and ruthless pragmatism. The Council possessed an armada of 2,000 pristine, heavily armed dreadnoughts. In a pitched battle, the human fleet would be reduced to slag in an afternoon. So, humanity simply refused to give them a pitched battle. Instead, the 300 human ships had fractured into dozens of autonomous wolf packs. They bypassed the heavily fortified military installations and struck exclusively at the soft underbelly of the Council's empire. They targeted slipspace relays, effectively blinding the Council's communication network. They blew up fuel depots, leaving massive armadas adrift and useless in deep space. They destroyed agricultural processing hubs, forcing the Council to divert its remaining active ships to transport food just to prevent mass riots on the core worlds. Humans fought a war of scraps. They lived in the dark, ran their engines on fumes, and struck with terrifying suicidal aggression before slipping back into the void. Back in the ruins of the spire, Victor Sullivan sat at a makeshift desk in the command bunker. The air purifiers hummed loudly, struggling to filter out the pervasive scent of burning permacrete and ash. The once mighty council was now a disorganized mess of terrified delegates shouting over static-filled comms channels. Gregory approached the desk, clutching a battered data slate. The avian technician had lost half his feathers to stress molting. "Minister," Gregory croaked, "we have lost contact with Sector 9. The agricultural shipments from the outer rim have completely ceased. The human raiding parties have destroyed the transit hubs." Victor rubbed his temples. A severe headache had taken up permanent residence behind his eyes. "Where is the Third Armada? They were ordered to secure that sector." "They are in Sector 9, sir, but they cannot move. The humans destroyed the local helium-3 refineries last week. The Armada is stranded in orbit, guarding dead space. Admiral Nelson demands supply ships." "With what fuel, Gregory?" Victor snapped, his composure finally slipping. "The humans hit Typhon. We have no fuel to send the supply ships to fuel the warships." He slammed his fist on the desk. The sheer, maddening logic of the human assault was unraveling him. For centuries, the Council had maintained order by building massive, terrifying ships to intimidate stationary planets. But you couldn't intimidate a fleet that had abandoned its home. You couldn't threaten the human homeworld because the human fleet had already written Earth off as a casualty of war. They were operating under the assumption that they had nothing left to lose. "They are starving us," Victor whispered, the realization settling into his bones like a deep frost. "They aren't trying to conquer us. They are trying to make our empire too expensive to maintain." "Sir," Gregory hesitated, looking nervously at the other delegates arguing in the dimly lit bunker. "There is something else, a transmission. It's bouncing off our remaining relays, repeating on an unencrypted frequency." Victor looked up. "From the humans?" "No, sir. From the subjugated worlds in the outer rim. The species we integrated over the last century." Gregory swallowed hard. "They are watching the humans dismantle our infrastructure. They are watching our dreadnoughts sit helpless without fuel." "Get to the point, Gregory. They are rebelling, Minister. Widespread insurrections in sectors 12, 13, and 14. The planetary governors are being overthrown. They are forming militias. They are calling it the human fracture. They realize we are bleeding, and the sharks are smelling the blood." Victor leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes. The polite fiction was dead. The galaxy had realized the Council was just a bureaucracy wrapped in heavy armor, and someone had finally found the gaps in the plating. "Draft a message," Victor said quietly. His voice sounded hollow, defeated. Gregory tapped his slate. "To our fleet commanders, sir?" "No. To the human flagship, to Akiva Shaw." Victor opened his eyes. They were entirely devoid of hope. Tell him the Council recognizes the sovereign independence of the Orion Spur. Tell him we are willing to discuss a cessation of hostilities." Gregory stared at him. "Minister, you are asking to negotiate." "Yes," Victor said bitterly. "I am." Aboard the lifeboat, hidden in the shadow of a gas giant, the comms console chirped. Scout Evans looked at the screen, her eyes widening in disbelief. She turned to Akiva, who was staring out the viewport at the swirling storms of the giant below. He looked older than he had 3 weeks ago. The war had carved deep lines into his face. "Akiva," Scout said softly. "It's a wide-burst transmission from the Council homeworld. It carries the ministerial seal." Akiva didn't turn around. "What does it say?" "It's an offer. Unconditional recognition of our borders. They want to negotiate a ceasefire." Akiva finally turned. He walked over to the console and looked at the glowing text. A month ago, he would have sacrificed a limb for that exact message. A month ago, it would have meant peace. It would have meant safety. But a month ago, the council still thought they owned the stars. They had forced humanity into a corner, forced them to abandon their homes, forced them to break their own flagship, and scatter their people into the cold void. They had taught humanity the brutal calculus of galactic survival. Akiva reached out and rested his hand over the comms panel. "Delete it," he said. Scout blinked. "Akiva, they are offering everything we originally asked for. They aren't offering peace, Scout. They are begging for time. If we stop now, they will rebuild their refineries. They will refuel their dreadnoughts. They will spend the next 50 years designing weapons specifically to counter our hit-and-run tactics. And then they will come for Earth again." He looked at the tactical map. The council was bleeding, but it wasn't dead. "They taught us how the game is played," Akiva said, his voice cold and hard as iron. "Negotiation is a courtesy, and right now, we can't afford to be polite." He looked at Scout, his eyes reflecting the harsh light of the monitors. "Tell Admiral Hayes to authorize Phase 3. We don't stop until they don't have a navy left." Fatigue settled into the bones of the human crews. It was a heavy, suffocating weight, born of recycled air, stimcaf, and the constant, vibrating threat of catastrophic failure. Aboard the lifeboat, the tactical screens flickered with micropower fluctuations. The stealth frigate had been running silent for a month, masking its thermal emissions by dumping excess heat into its own internal heat sinks. The ambient temperature in the command module hovered near 35 degrees Celsius. Akiva Shaw wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He stared at the holographic map projecting from the center table. The red dots, representing the mighty Council Armada, were no longer pulsing aggressively outward. They were static, trapped. "Admiral Hayes has positioned the strike groups," Scout Evans said. Her voice was raspy. She hadn't slept for more than 2 hours at a time since the war began. "Wolfpack Echo is holding at the edge of the Sirius sector. Vanguard Delta is creeping along the perimeter of the core." "And the anchors?" Akiva asked, leaning heavily against the console. "Target locked," Scout confirmed. She tapped a sequence into her slate. The holographic map shifted, zooming in on the massive artificial structures orbiting the edges of the Council's inner systems. These were the slipspace anchors. The Council built their dreadnoughts to project overwhelming power, making them vast, heavily armored fortresses. But that mass came with a critical flaw. They were too heavy to calculate independent slipspace jumps over long distances. They relied on a network of massive gravitational tethers, the anchors, to slingshot them through the void. Phase 3 wasn't about fighting the dreadnoughts. Phase 3 was about cutting the strings. "Tell Hayes to execute," Akiva ordered. He didn't blink. He just watched the map. Across 20 different sectors, human destroyers dropped their stealth fields. They didn't target the massive capital ships parked uselessly in orbit above the core worlds. They ignored the frantic sensor pings and the uncoordinated laser fire from panicked local defense stations. Instead, the human ships aimed their spinal railguns at the slipspace anchors. The physics of the attack were brutally simple. The railguns fired slugs of dense depleted uranium at a fraction of the speed of light. The anchors, massive arrays of delicate gravitational lenses and exotic matter containment fields, shattered upon impact. There were no massive explosions, no fiery shockwaves. In the vacuum of space, the anchors simply broke apart, their containment fields collapsing in a silent, invisible burst of localized gravity. On the map inside the lifeboat, the green lines connecting the council systems, the interstellar highways that held their empire together, winked out of existence. Akiva let out a long, slow breath. The deed was done. "They are blind," Scout whispered, staring at the empty space on the projection. "And they are caged." Without the anchors, the Council dreadnoughts were permanently marooned in their respective star systems. They had become extremely expensive, heavily armed museum pieces. The human fleet, utilizing lighter ships and riskier, unanchored jump drives, now had absolute freedom of movement across the entire galaxy. Deep beneath the ruined surface of the Council homeworld, Victor Sullivan felt the temperature drop. The environmental controls in the bunker were failing. With the planetary shield generators destroyed and the upper atmosphere choked with ash from the Defiance's impact, the solar collectors on the surface were useless. The bunker was running on auxiliary plasma generators, and the fuel for those was severely rationed. Victor sat wrapped in a heavy synthetic coat. The grand amphitheater above was a memory. His reality was now concrete walls, flickering red emergency lights, and the sour smell of unwashed bodies. "Minister," Technician Gregory croaked. The avian alien looked terrible. His feathers were brittle and gray, molting in jagged patches. He clutched a datapad to his chest like a shield. "We just received a burst transmission from the outer picket lines. It's the anchor network, sir." Victor didn't look up from the useless manifest reports scattered across his makeshift desk. "Which nodes are down?" "All of them," Gregory whispered. The silence in the bunker deepened. Even the frantic, terrified arguments of the remaining delegates ceased as the words echoed off the concrete walls. Admiral Nelson, sitting slumped in a corner with a half-empty ration tin, slowly raised his head. "Repeat that, technician," Nelson demanded, his voice hollow. The human strike teams coordinated a simultaneous strike across the inner ring, Gregory explained, his compound eyes darting nervously around the room. "The slipspace anchors are destroyed. The navigational grid has collapsed." "Can we repair them?" Delegate Peterson asked. His massive frame had shrunk visibly over the past month. He looked deflated, his gray skin sagging. "With what?" Nelson barked, standing up with sudden, desperate energy. "We don't have the industrial capacity to build a shuttle right now, let alone a gravitational lens. Our shipyards are slag. Our supply lines are gone." He turned to Victor, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Sullivan, do you understand what this means? The Third Armada over Sirius, the home fleet parked above us. They cannot jump. We are confined to local space." Victor finally looked up. He felt completely detached from his own body. He was watching a tragedy play out from 1,000 miles away. "They built a wall," Victor said softly. Nelson scoffed. "What wall? They destroyed our infrastructure." "A wall keeps things out, Admiral," Victor corrected, his voice raspy. "But it also keeps things in. Shaw isn't trying to invade the core. He just locked the door from the outside. We are quarantined." The reality of the human strategy crashed down upon the delegates. They had expected a climactic final battle. They had expected the human fleet to jump into the core, guns blazing, seeking vengeance for the decades of extortion and threats. The Council understood violence. They understood conquest. They did not understand isolation. "They are going to leave us here," Peterson realized, his voice trembling. "We have 80 billion citizens on the homeworld. We import 90% of our food. Without the fleet to escort the agricultural haulers—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The math was already doing the work in everyone's head. Months bled into one another. Space has no seasons, no days, no nights. There is only the shift change, the hum of the drive core, and the relentless march of logistics. Aboard the Gettysburg, Admiral Hayes reviewed the surveillance feeds. The human fleet had established a loose blockade just outside the sensor range of the Council's core systems. They didn't engage the local defense platforms. They didn't provoke the stranded dreadnoughts. They simply acted as a net, catching the occasional desperate blockade runner attempting to smuggle supplies from the rebelling outer worlds. Akiva Shaw sat beside the Admiral. He looked at the high-resolution imagery, captured by a stealth drone flying through the upper atmosphere of the Council homeworld. The planet was dying. Without the imported shipments of synthesized proteins and hydroponic yields from the outer agricultural rings, the capital had descended into anarchy. The glittering spires that hadn't been toppled by the kinetic strike were completely dark. Millions of small, localized fires dotted the massive cityscapes. The grand avenues, once reserved for diplomatic parades, were choked with the wreckage of hover transports and the makeshift barricades of a starving populace. "They are eating each other," Hayes said bluntly, tapping a thick finger against the screen. Thermal imaging shows massive heat blooms in the residential sectors. Riots. The local security forces lost control 3 weeks ago. Akiva felt a sickening churn in his stomach. He had authorized this. He had sat in the Defiance, looked Victor Sullivan in the eye, and pulled the trigger on a strategy that resulted in this slow, agonizing collapse. "We stopped 2 supply haulers from the Centaurus faction yesterday," Hayes continued, oblivious to Akiva's internal turmoil. "They tried to slip past Vanguard Delta. We disabled their engines and vented their cargo bays. No casualties, but the food is gone." "Good," Akiva managed to say. The word tasted like ash. "The outer rim is fully radicalized," Scout Evans added, stepping into the briefing room with a fresh stack of tactical reports. "The subjugated species have formed their own provisional governments. They are actively hunting down the remaining Council overseers. They want to open diplomatic relations with us." "Tell them to wait," Akiva replied. "We don't negotiate until the Council officially surrenders." "Akiva," Scout said gently, lowering the datapad. "There might not be a Council left to surrender." Back on the homeworld, the bunker was a tomb. The auxiliary generators had failed 2 days ago. The only light came from the dim, dying batteries of emergency glow strips. The air was thick, heavy with carbon dioxide and the stench of death. Delegate Peterson was dead. He had been killed a week prior, not by the humans, but by his own security detail in a desperate fight over a cache of nutrient paste. Admiral Nelson had taken his own life shortly after the anchor network fell, unable to bear the shame of commanding a fleet of useless, floating metal coffins. Victor Sullivan sat on the cold floor, his back resting against the cracked permacrete wall. He was starving. His thick frame had withered, his skin hanging loose over his joints. The translation collar around his neck was dead, its battery drained long ago. Gregory lay curled a few feet away. The avian technician was barely breathing. His eyes were milky and unblinking. Victor reached into his coat and pulled out a small, hardened emergency communicator. It was a localized transmitter, designed to punch a signal through the planet's atmospheric interference. It had one charge left. He didn't want to conquer anymore. He didn't care about the Orion Spur, or the mining rights, or the grand design of the Galaxy Council. The polite fiction had been burned away, leaving nothing but the brutal truth of survival. With shaking skeletal fingers, Victor activated the transmitter. He tuned it to the unencrypted human military frequency. "Shaw," Victor rasped. He didn't know if the translation software on the human end would pick up his native clicks and hisses, but he had to try. "Shaw, if you are listening..." He paused, coughing weakly. The dust in the air scratched his lungs. "We are broken," Victor whispered into the dark. "The spire is gone. The fleet is dead. My people are starving in the dark. You have won the war of attrition." He closed his eyes, remembering the arrogant minister he had been just months ago. The predator playing with dead prey. Now, the roles were completely reversed. The humans hadn't just beaten them. They had exposed them to the entire galaxy as a paper tiger. "Please," Victor begged, the word feeling strange and heavy on his tongue. It was a word the Council had never learned to use. "We will disband the fleet. We will yield the core systems. We will sign whatever treaty you put in front of us. Just open the lanes. Let the food ships through. Please." Aboard the Gettysburg, the transmission played over the bridge speakers. The bridge crew, hardened veterans who had spent months living on the edge of destruction, fell silent. The raw, unfiltered desperation in the alien's voice transcended the translation software. Akiva stared at the comms panel. He looked at Scout. She didn't offer advice. She just watched him, waiting for the order. Admiral Hayes crossed his arms, his face impassive. This was the moment, the absolute capitulation of the greatest empire in galactic history. It hadn't been achieved with a massive, glorious fleet battle. It had been achieved by systematically removing the gears of their civilization until the machine ground itself to dust. Akiva slowly reached forward. He pressed the broadcast stud. "Minister Sullivan," Akiva said. His voice was steady, but it carried the immense weight of the millions of lives he had snuffed out through logistics and starvation. "This is Akiva Shaw. We accept your unconditional surrender." Akiva let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 6 months. He looked at Hayes. "Order Vanguard Delta to stand down," Akiva instructed, his voice cracking slightly. "Open the blockade. Let the Centaurus supply haulers through to the homeworld." Hayes nodded once. "Aye, sir. Relaying orders now." Akiva stood up from the console. His knees popped. He felt incredibly old. He had saved humanity. He had dismantled an empire that had terrorized the stars for millennia. But as he looked at the tactical map, watching the green icons of human ships move aside to let the desperately needed food reach the dying planet, he felt no triumph. He just felt the exhaustion of a man who had stared into the abyss and realized he was perfectly capable of pushing an entire civilization into it. "Negotiations begin tomorrow," Akiva said quietly to Scout as he turned to leave the bridge. "Let's hope to God we build something better than they did." Peace did not arrive with a parade. It arrived in the belly of a stripped-down human cargo shuttle, smelling heavily of industrial solvent and recycled sweat. The rendezvous point was a dead coordinate in the neutral zone between the core and the Orion spur. There was no grand amphitheater. There were no holographic projectors or plush leather chairs. There was only a bolted-down aluminum table, 2 harsh overhead lumens, and the cold, vibrating deck of a ship that had spent the last 6 months running dark. Akiva Shaw sat on one side of the table. He wore his standard-issue gray uniform. It was clean, but the frayed cuffs betrayed its age. Beside him, Scout Evans arranged a stack of physical paper documents. Humanity had insisted on paper. Digital files could be altered, corrupted, or erased. Paper was permanent. Paper carried weight. The airlock hissed, cycling with a heavy, mechanical thud. The interior door slid open. Victor Sullivan stepped into the room. He was escorted by 2 heavily armed human Marines, but the guards were entirely unnecessary. The minister of the Galaxy Council was a ghost of the entity Akiva had spoken to months ago. The thick, muscular frame that had once projected absolute authority had withered. His tailored tunic hung off his skeletal shoulders like a sack. His scales had lost their luster, flaking away in dull, gray patches. He walked with a slight limp, his multi-jointed legs shaking with the effort of supporting his own diminished weight. Victor looked at the aluminum table. He looked at Akiva. He did not see a conqueror gloating over a victory. He saw a man who looked just as exhausted, just as hollowed out by the calculus of war. "Sit," Akiva said, gesturing to the folding metal chair opposite him. Victor sat slowly. His joints popped in the quiet room. He placed his hands on the table. They were trembling. "I expected a military tribunal. We aren't here to put you on trial," Akiva replied, his voice flat. He pushed a glass of water across the table. "Drink. You look like you're about to collapse." Victor stared at the water for a long moment before wrapping his long, bony fingers around the glass. He drank it in one long, desperate pull. The cold shock of it seemed to anchor him slightly to reality. "If this is not a trial," Victor rasped, his natural voice clicking softly alongside the crude, handheld translator device he now wore around his neck. "Then what is it?" Scout slid the first stack of papers across the aluminum surface. "This is the dismantling of the Galaxy Council. We are here to establish the new borders, the new trade agreements, and the disarmament protocols for your remaining naval assets." Victor looked down at the dense, typewritten pages. He couldn't read the English text, but the translation device projected a crude, localized hologram above the paper, rendering the legalistic human phrasing into his native dialect. He read the first paragraph. He stopped. He read it again. "You are granting autonomy to the Outer Rim," Victor whispered, looking up. "Complete sovereignty. You aren't annexing them. We don't want an empire," Akiva said. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Empires require maintenance. They require fleets of dreadnoughts and an endless supply of bodies to enforce compliance. We fought this war because we refuse to be part of your machine. We certainly aren't going to build our own." Victor flipped to the next page. His eyes widened. "The dismantling of the dreadnoughts. You are requiring us to scrap 90% of our heavy hulls. You are demanding we convert our shipyards to produce civilian freighters and agricultural haulers. Your people are starving, Sullivan," Scout interjected, her tone devoid of sympathy. "You need tractors, not warships. The remaining 10% of your fleet will be retrofitted with tracking beacons." They will serve strictly as a localized defense force for the core systems. If a single Council dreadnought crosses into the Outer Rim or the Orion Spur, we will interpret it as an act of war, and we will not bother targeting your slipspace anchors next time. We will just glass the shipyards. Victor slumped back in his chair. The absolute terrifying pragmatism of the humans was staggering. They had brought the galaxy to its knees, shattered the greatest military force ever assembled, and their primary demand was that everyone simply stay in their own backyards and farm. You are leaving a power vacuum, Victor argued, a flicker of the old politician returning to his voice. The galaxy has relied on the Council for stability for 6 millennia. If you shatter the central authority, the Outer Rim will devolve into sectarian violence. The subjugated species will fight each other for territory. You are trading a dictatorship for anarchy. Freedom is messy, Akiva replied evenly. It's loud, it's chaotic, and it's dangerous, but it is theirs to navigate. We will establish a neutral arbitration forum on Earth. If species want to negotiate treaties or resolve border disputes, they can do it there. But there will be no central army, there will be no tribute. Victor stared at the human diplomat. He tried to find the deception. He tried to find the hidden clause where humanity seized control of the vital resource lanes or established a puppet government. It wasn't there. Why? Victor asked, his voice cracking. You could have it all. You could sit on the apex of the spire. You could dictate the future of 1 trillion lives. Why break the throne and walk away? Akiva looked at the stack of papers. He thought of the Defiance, a billion-dollar marvel of engineering, turned into a dumb, kinetic slug. He thought of the burning fuel depots, the collapsed transit hubs, and the starving millions on the planet below. He thought of the terrible things he had ordered in the name of survival. Because power like that rots you from the inside out, Akiva said softly. It makes you think negotiation is a courtesy instead of a necessity. It makes you think you are untouchable. We broke your empire, Sullivan, because you forgot that every civilization has a breaking point. We are making sure no one gets big enough to forget that again. Akiva uncapped a heavy black ink pen. He set it on top of the treaty. Sign the paper, Victor. Go home. Feed your people. Victor looked at the pen. It was a primitive tool. It required physical pressure. It required intent. He picked it up. It felt impossibly heavy in his weakened grip. He pressed the nib to the coarse paper and signed his name in a jagged alien script. It took 3 seconds. 6,000 years of galactic hegemony ended with a scratch of ink on real paper. 14 months later, the galaxy was a very different place. The grand highways of the core systems, the neat glowing lines of the slipspace anchor network, remained dark. Travel between the stars was no longer a matter of luxurious, instantaneous transit. It was slow. It required localized jump drives, precise calculations, and a healthy respect for the vast, terrifying emptiness of deep space. In orbit above Earth, the UNS Gettysburg had been permanently dry docked, serving as the central hub for the newly formed coalition of independent systems. It was not an empire. It was a loud, disorganized, constantly arguing assembly of 60 different species, all trying to figure out how to govern themselves without a gun pointed at their heads. Scout Evans walked through the bustling corridors of the converted carrier. The sterile military precision of the ship had been entirely compromised. Alien delegates in pressurized environmental suits argued with human quartermasters over docking fees. Spindly avian traders hawked rare minerals from the deep rim, while heavy, blocky entities from the core worlds negotiated agricultural imports. It was chaotic. It smelled like 12 different atmospheres mixed together. It was beautiful. Scout pushed through the heavy blast doors into the primary observation deck. Akiva Shaw was standing by the massive armored viewport, looking down at the blue and green marble of Earth. He wore civilian clothes now, a thick wool sweater and dark trousers. He had resigned his military commission the day after the treaty was signed. "They're voting on the Centaurus trade dispute in an hour," Scout said, stepping up beside him. She handed him a mug of coffee. Real coffee. The supply lines to South America had reopened months ago. Akiva took the mug, relishing the heat against his palms. "Let me guess. The Centaurians want a 50% tariff on helium-3 imports, and the aquatic sectors are threatening a blockade." "Close," Scout smiled slightly. "They're threatening a boycott. Nobody is threatening blockades anymore. Admiral Hayes made it very clear that any species attempting to restrict civilian supply lines will find their own shipyards mysteriously lacking gravity." Akiva chuckled. It was a rough, rusty sound. Hayes always did have a gift for diplomacy. He looked back out the window. The scars of the war were still fresh. Humanity had lost nearly a quarter of its deep space infrastructure. Millions of people had died in the outer colonies during the initial council raids before the Defiance struck the spire. The trauma of the conflict would echo for generations, but they had survived. They had stared down a monolithic giant, refused to play by its rules, and dragged it down into the mud. "Sullivan sent a message this morning," Scout noted, pulling up a brief text log on her datapad. Akiva raised an eyebrow. "How is the former minister?" "He's running a hydroponics distribution center on the home world," Scout read, scanning the lines. "He says the local militias have finally agreed to a ceasefire. The food rationing is stabilizing. He requested an audience next month to discuss expanding their import quotas for soy and wheat." "Approve it," Akiva said, taking a sip of his coffee. It tasted like dirt and chocolate. It was perfect. "Let him come here. Let him sit in a waiting room with the same outer rim species he used to tax into poverty. It'll be good for his soul." Scout shut off the datapad. She leaned against the railing next to Akiva. For a long time, they just watched the slow rotation of the Earth below them. The massive orbital defense platforms were still there, silent and vigilant, but they were no longer pointed outward in fear. They were anchored, acting as a shield for a world that had finally earned its place in the dark. "Did we do the right thing, Akiva?" Scout asked quietly. The weight of the question lingered in the air between them. It was the question they all asked themselves in the quiet hours of the night. "We caused so much suffering. We broke the galaxy." Akiva traced the rim of his coffee mug with his thumb. He thought of the panic in the council chamber. He thought of the cold, calculated kinetic strike that vaporized the spire. He thought of the deliberate, tactical starvation of a civilization. It was an ugly, brutal calculus. "We didn't break the galaxy, Scout," Akiva said, his voice grounded in a profound, cynical certainty. "The galaxy was already broken. It was just wrapped in a very polite, very expensive lie. We just stripped away the lie." He looked at the stars. They were no longer the domain of a single, arrogant empire. They were a wild, untamed frontier. They belonged to anyone brave enough or desperate enough to sail into the black. Negotiation is a courtesy, Akiva murmured, echoing the sentiment that had started the fire. But freedom is a right, and sometimes you have to burn down the house to get out of the basement. He turned away from the window, walking back toward the noise, the chaos, and the messy reality of a liberated universe. The war was over. The hard part had just begun. Thank you for surviving the war of attrition with us. If you loved seeing humanity turn the tables through sheer, ruthless pragmatism, do not forget to obliterate that like button. Share this video with anyone who appreciates a deeply grounded sci-fi HFY story, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next foray into the stars. Let us know in the comments, would you have chosen to rule the council or break the throne like Shaw did? See you in the next universe.